Your wealth, of course, was a social creation, a collective success, like all wealth creation. You benefited from infrastructure, from education, from healthcare, from the law courts that protected your property, and so on and so on. But you also benefited from all the knowledge that's been accumulated over centuries by all of humanity. So there is just, you have duties towards society, towards humanity. So you cannot just say, that's it, I'm done, I became rich, thanks to all the hard work of everybody, and now I move to another planet. That's just impossible to defend. Now we need to make that transition towards progressive wealth taxation for the super rich.
So if we don't do it, democracy's at stake.
I think this is the battle of the 21st century.
Some of the most popular episodes of Downstream have involved one person, Gary Stevenson, with one very clear message. That is, we need to tax the rich. We need to tax, in particular, wealth. That message has a certain amount of authority because of Gary Stevenson, his accomplishments, his CV. He studied maths and economics at the LSE. He studied economics at Oxford. He went to Citibank, made a ton of money as a trader. When he talks about this stuff, he has authority, the credentials, he knows what he's talking about. Here's the thing. Today's guest is the authority for Gary Stevenson. He told us that we have to talk to this guy while he's in town. Gabriel Zucman is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics. He's also taught in the US. He's taught at the London School of Economics. He's a founding director of the International Tax Observatory. He's written a bunch of books on this topic. Billionaires are the word on everybody's lips. For some people, they're the source of all innovation and economic growth. For others, they are causing political, social, and economic chaos. They are a problem. Whatever your views, you're going to want to watch today's show because Gabriel Zucman, my guest, is, I think, the world's leading economist on what a wealth tax could do, how it would be implemented, and what problems it's seeking to solve. He's written a fabulous new book. We need to tax billionaires. Pretty clear about his agenda, and it's really pithy with regards to not just the policy, but the data. What are the effective rates of tax that a working person is paying in France compared to a billionaire, for instance? And some of those numbers really will dazzle you. Gabriel, it's such a pleasure to have you on Downstream. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about your new book, We Need to Tax Billionaires. Very emphatic. You're saying it many times. It's very short for people that are thinking of buying it. I can't recommend it enough regardless, but it's always helpful when it's short, isn't it? You're making that argument. We're going to talk about that argument about taxing billionaires, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it for an hour. But you're doing that in response to a problem, which is inequality. So before we go into the solution you're proposing, how it would work, how bad is this issue of inequality in 2026?
There's been an explosion of billionaire wealth over the last decades and of the wealth of the super rich more broadly. It's been one of the most important developments in the world economy, with an acceleration after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and an acceleration of the acceleration over the last couple of years. Like between March 2024 and March 2026, global billionaire wealth has increased 40%, 40, coming on top of everything that happened before that. So now we are in a situation where global billionaires used to own the equivalent of 3% of world GDP in wealth in 1987, when Forbes magazine started tracking billionaires. And today, the billionaires own the equivalent of 17% of world GDP. And we're talking about roughly 3,000 families who, if they spend their wealth, they could buy the equivalent of 17% of the value of all the goods and services that are produced in a given year all around the world. So that's the situation. And you've seen that pretty much everywhere, in the European Union, in the US, in the UK. In the UK, there is the famous Sunday Times Rich List, which started in 1989. In 1989, the 200 wealthiest families in the UK owned the equivalent of 5% of the UK's GDP in wealth. Today, it's 25%. Okay, so again, 200 families who, if they spend their wealth, they could buy a quarter of everything that's produced in a given year.
So
in the UK.
1989,
Yeah.
it was 5%.
5.
And that's after 10 years of Margaret Thatcher.
Exactly, yes. We like to know what it was in 79, but the Sunday Times rich list only started in 89.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
So it's a global phenomenon. You just said 3,000 billionaire families have about 17% of global wealth. That's an extraordinary statistic. Why is it getting worse? You're saying it's accelerating since the global financial crisis, and then in the last 2 years, you've said it's gone up 40%. So why is the acceleration accelerating? Why is it getting, progressively more of an issue?
It's because fundamentally, wealth for the super rich is power. Wealth is the power to influence markets by buying competitors, for instance, by cementing monopoly positions. Is the power to influence the prevailing ideology by buying media, newspapers, TV channels, radio stations. It's the power to influence policymaking. It's the power to buy elections, and so on and so on. And so there's a kind of a doom loop where wealth begets more power, begets more wealth. And it's been probably one of the main drivers for the rise and the acceleration that we've seen in recent years. Look at what happens in the US, where there's a significant fraction of the world billionaires are based there, and where we're witnessing the plutocratic capture of the US federal government by ultra-wealthy individuals. Like just a couple of days ago, Donald Trump signed a deal with the IRS. He was suing the IRS for $10 billion because his tax returns had leaked a few years ago. And so he was asking $10 billion from the agency that he controls as president of the US. And they made a deal where he's not going to get $10 billion, but the IRS is committing to never audit his tax return or the tax return of his family forever. That tells you something about the kind of the type of corruption and more than that, the plutocratic capture that we're witnessing today in the US. And what I want to emphasize is that because sometimes people look at the US and they say, well, it's crazy what happens there, but it can only happen there. And, it's not a risk here in the UK or in other countries. And I think that's wrong. I think that this type of plutocratic capture can materialize very fast in just a few years. And I guess if you had asked people, even people who are concerned about these issues 10 years ago in the US, whether they could think of something like that happening in the next 10 years, I think nobody really expected that level of oligarchic drift. So it can happen very fast. It can happen everywhere. And that's the fundamental tension that we are facing today in our democratic societies. And there's always a fundamental tension, to be clear, between an extreme concentration of wealth on the one hand and the very possibility of a well-functioning democracy. And all the thinkers of and the people who have written about democracy have highlighted this tension all the way back to Aristotle, to people like Leah Yippi today at the London School of Economics. It's just that for some period of time after World War II, people forgot a little bit about this fundamental tension because extreme wealth after the war had not completely disappeared, but was really at a historically low level. And so people thought, okay, these issues belong to the past. And they've been making this comeback very powerfully over the last few decades. And again, with an acceleration over the last few years.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as I enjoyed reading Gabriel's book. Super informative person. This is a conversation that lots of people are having, but he's really getting into the stats, the figures, what we can actually do, how it might actually work, how it might be implemented. Wealth and how we tax it, I think, is one of the big questions of the 2020s and the 2030s. If this just keeps on going, I think democracy is at stake. We need to sort it out. This kind of conversation that we're having with people like Gabriel simply would not happen on the likes of the BBC or Sky News or GB News or in most of this country's newspapers. Why? Why would it be in the Sunday Times, this kind of depth? Well, because these outlets are owned by millionaires and billionaires. almost always they represent the interests of those people. They might give a hearing, but there's always an agenda at stake. If you think we need platforms where these kinds of common sense ideas are discussed, debated, interrogated, then why not support our work? Here at Novara Media, we have 1.2 million YouTube subscribers, millions of people across social media, hundreds of thousands of you watch these downstreams every week. Why not support our work? Just a tiny fraction of you need to get on board the Novara train, and we can take these conversations to an even broader audience. It's never been more important, and I really mean that. It's all up for grabs ahead of the next general election in this country, at least. If you agree, support our work, go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. Help us build a new media for different politics. So somebody who is aware of your book, aware of you, aware of your thinking, aware of this argument, but who disagrees in a British context, they might agree with you in an American context, but not a British context, they might come back and say, well, hold on, Gabriel, I've looked at the data. In terms of income inequality in Britain, actually, it's actually slightly more equal than it was before the global financial crisis, but it's baselined. What are you talking about? And inequality has not grown. It's much higher. Granted, it's much higher than the 1970s, but it's kind of stagnated. Are they looking at the wrong thing?
I think it really depends on what you're looking at. If you look at the share of income that's earned by the top 10% highest income earners or the top 1% highest earners, I think it's fair to say that it has increased in the 1980s, 1990s, and then it has somewhat stabilized over the last 15 years. What I'm talking about is really about a different problem. The top 1%, in the UK, it's going to be, you have roughly 30 million households. So we're talking about 300,000 households. That's the top 1%. I'm talking about the extremely wealthy, those who are on the Sunday Times rich list, essentially, those who have more than 100 million pounds in wealth, and especially the billionaires. We're talking about just a few hundred families. It's very different. And it's a very different population. And that's where wealth is concentrating today. And that's where the growth of inequality is happening today. And one reason why it's not been emphasized more in the past is, first of all, this trend is relatively recent, or its acceleration at least, but also because there's a lot of opacity about extreme wealth. There's no public statistics on the super wealthy, on their assets, the income they earn, the taxes that they pay. So we have very good data for based on household surveys or even tax data for almost all of the population, but the extremely wealthy, they are not in our government statistics yet. And so, because of that blind spot, we tend to ignore a little bit what's happening at the very top. And even though I think we are at a stage where we really have to care about these extremely wealthy people, not only because of the democratic questions that we discussed, but also from a purely public finance perspective. Even if you don't care about inequality, which I think you should, even if you don't care about the battle between oligarchic forces and democratic forces, which I think you should care. But even if you don't care about these issues and you only care about balancing the budget, the books, you care about public debt and deficits and the bond market, then even from that very narrow perspective, you cannot ignore the problem anymore, because now the government revenue at stake, from taxing or not taxing the ultra wealthy becomes very significant. Just, everybody can understand that if we get back to the numbers that I mentioned previously, when the 200 wealthiest families own the equivalent of 5% of GDP in wealth, it means that if you taxed their wealth at 2%, let's say, this would bring 0.1% of GDP in additional tax revenue. You could say, well, who cares about that? In the big picture, there's a deficit of 4 or 5% of GDP. It's not going to make a material difference. But now when they own 25% of GDP in wealth, if you tax that at just 2%, you get 0.5% of GDP in additional tax revenue. 0.5% of GDP, that's 15 billion pounds per year. Keir Starmer famously wanted to cut winter fuel allowances for retirees. He was expecting 1.5 billion pounds in additional, revenue from that, and with just 2% on roughly 1,000 families who own more than 100 million pounds in wealth, you can get 10 times more money, 15 billion pounds. So that's also the reason why today it's not possible anymore to ignore the upsurge of extreme wealth. Or to put it differently, there's a positive element in this evolution. The positive element is you have a very dynamic tax base, which is not taxed today, but which could bring now a significant amount of tax revenue. So now I'm not saying that this is going to be enough to solve all the budget issues of this country or France or other countries. I'm not saying that this is going to be enough for all the investments we need to make in education, in healthcare, in the energy transition. Not at all. 0.5% of GDP clearly is not enough, but it's absolutely necessary. I don't see how we're going to be able to make those investments. I don't see how we're going to be able to address our public finance issues as long as those whose wealth is skyrocketing and who pay much less tax than the rest of the population are not asked to contribute a bit more.
What you say about if you're on the right or the centre right, well, this can pay down deficits. I find that fascinating. It's really striking because a wealth tax is a policy that's promoted by the left. You get this thing of negative polarisation where the right immediately says, no, it's a terrible idea. But you think if you were a popular centre-right politician, you could introduce a wealth tax. You can say, we're going to use this 15 billion to pay down the deficit and we're going to increase police spending by 40%, if that's your agenda. And for your voters, that would be so popular. But they can't do it because it's coded as very left-wing. On the billionaires point, you're a Frenchman. Let's talk about France. How many billionaires does a country like France have, more or less? And what's the effective rate of tax that they're paying compared to, let's not talk about working class, a very broad term, compared to the middle class, right? The people that are professionals, doctors, teachers, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the type of computation that I try to explain in the book, We Need to Tax Billionaires. There's been a lot of research over the last few years, it's quite recent, trying to compute the total effective tax rate of billionaires and to make it comparable to what the rest of the population pays in taxes. Now, there's a long tradition of public economics, of research in that area, which started in the 1940s with some economists in the US, Helen Tarasov, Gerhard Kolm, who were the first to ask the question, who pays the taxes? But until a few years ago, the super rich were not part of the picture because of the lack of public data. And now that opacity has started to dissipate thanks to an international research effort where different teams of researchers have partnered in different countries with tax administrations to link businesses to their owners and to look at the true income of the super rich. No, the true income of the super rich is their share of the profits of the companies that they own. And to look also at the taxes that they effectively pay, all included. So not only the taxes that they pay personally as individuals, but also the taxes that they pay indirectly through the corporations that they own. So now we can have this comprehensive perspective on taxation. And so let's look at how the picture looks like for France. So if you look at the working class, that we can define as the 50% of the population with the lowest income, and if you look at all the taxes that they pay relative to their income, their tax rate is around 40%. They pay a lot of tax. Why? Because you have high VAT, consumption taxes, payroll taxes, some income tax. There's a 10% income tax in France that's withheld on any income, no matter how much you earn.
So wait, hold on. The tax threshold in the UK is about £12,500.
Yeah.
In France, there's no tax
In France,
threshold.
in France, it's a very weird system where you have two income taxes. There is one which is progressive, like in the UK, where you have some exemption threshold, and then the rate increases with your income. And then there's another, in fact, bigger income tax, which is a flat rate of 10% on all income from the very first euro of wage that you earn. Even if you work part-time at the minimum wage, you have to pay 10%. Anyway, the consequence is that the working class pays roughly 40% of their income in taxes. The middle class pays roughly 45, 50%. The upper middle class, a bit more than 50%. And then it collapses. The tax rate collapses to 25% for billionaires. 25%, which is half as much as the rest of the population. Why is that possible? Where is that coming from? That's due to the fact that for the super rich, the income tax, which in principle is the pillar of tax progressivity, it's supposed to be the way that we make the rich pay their fair share. The income tax vanishes for the super wealthy. And concretely, what they do is that they put their wealth in holding companies, which are kind of shell companies. It's a tax avoidance technique which is widespread among the very wealthy, and not only in France, but everywhere, almost everywhere in the world. There's an interesting exception, which is the US, that I'll get back to. But whether it's in the UK or in France or in other countries, past a certain level of wealth, it's systematic that people put their wealth, which is mostly shares of the companies that they own, in a holding company. And so the holding company receives income, dividend income, and because the income on paper, these are all accounting games and there's no substance in any of that, but on paper, the income is paid not to an individual, but to a company. That income essentially goes tax-free, free of personal income tax, and there's typically no tax that's paid at the level of the holding company. And so the consequence is that the effective income tax rate, personal income tax rate for billionaires in France is just 2%. They pay 2% of their income only in taxes, and many of them close to 0%. And we now have studies for about 10 countries, France, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, Italy, US, Brazil, and so on, where everywhere we see the same pattern. We see that the working class pays a lot of tax, consumption taxes, the middle class pays a lot, but the ultra wealthy everywhere have much lower effective tax rates than the rest of the population. We suspected, I think many people suspected that this was the case, but until 3-4 years ago, there was just no hard statistical evidence on this. And now the reality is emerging, and it's deeply disturbing because this regressivity is a violation of the fundamental principle of equality before the law. Equality before the law, the most conservative interpretation that you can make of that principle is that wealthier individuals shouldn't be allowed to pay less tax relative to their income than the rest of the population. And this is precisely the situation we're in today, where essentially the super rich can live in their own parallel society, almost free of tax. And of course, there's a proper debate to have. There's a legitimate debate to have about the proper degree of tax progressivity, meaning the extent to which wealthier individuals should pay more tax relative to their income than the rest of the population. And it's totally normal for people to disagree about that. More conservative people, they will favor less progressivity. More left-wing people, they will favor more progressivity. It will always be a central aspect of political conflict, and it's easy to get it wrong, to have too much progressivity or too little. These are complicated questions, and fine. But I think no one should agree, and fundamentally no one agrees with the possibility that the wealthiest people in society should be allowed to contribute less than school teachers or, workers, retirees, what have you, the rest of the population. That's just fundamentally a violation of this core principle of equality before the law, which is at the heart, at the core of the rule of law, of what it means to live in a democracy. And so this is this anomaly that's been put to light by this recent wave of research that I describe in the book. The book is mostly about, okay, what have we learned over the last 3-4 years from this international research agenda? What are the facts? And of course, if we then the second part is, okay, if we take those facts seriously, what is, in my view, the most logical solution to that problem?
Can capitalism be fixed? That's the kind of question you have really strong opinions about, isn't it? No, yes, of course it can. Capitalism is the greatest system ever. It's the source of all evil. It makes people have very strong feelings. It's a question that we will be putting to Mariana Mazzucato at a forthcoming event on June the 22nd at Earth Theatre in Hackney. Before that conversation with Mariana about the future of capitalism, the pitfalls, the possibilities, my colleague Ash Sarkar will be talking to the former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John McDonnell. Like I say, June 22nd in Hackney, the sun will be out. Huge, important, intriguing question. Grab a beer. That's my idea of fun. Have you seen Jeff Bezos in the last few days talk about the very lowest earners paying no tax? Have you seen this?
Yes, I've seen that.
He's talking about how we need to zone out the bottom 50% to pay no tax. And for me, that feels like he's trying to build the political argument that nobody should pay any tax, including him. We saw it with the coalition in this country after 2010. They're saying, well, bring the tax threshold up. You keep more of your own money. What they really mean is my funders can also keep more of their money.
Yeah, I've seen his comments, and it's really problematic. But it's not just him. It's a perspective that you often hear in the public debate that says, okay, only the rich pay taxes, and the top 10% accounts for 70% of the taxes, and so on. And that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding and deception, which is that it's only looking at one tax, which is the income tax. The income tax is just one among many other taxes, and it's supposed to be the one progressive tax, the one tax that makes the rich pay, and so it's supposed to offset, in particular, the regressivity of consumption taxes, which are very heavy and which absorb a bigger fraction of income for the poor than for the rich, because the poor consume a greater fraction of their income. And so, of course, if you just focus on the one tax that's supposed to be progressive, it's true that, a high share of the income tax, a high fraction of the income tax is paid by the rich, and there is some progressivity up to some point. But there are two problems with this
Hold
argument.
on, but you said by the rich, but we're talking about the top 10% here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that the two problems with this argument is that, what do we mean by the rich? If it's the top 10%, yeah, sure, they pay as a group. Top 10% is like 3 million households in the UK. They pay income tax as a group. But not people like Bezos, right? Not the billionaires who completely avoid the income tax. Look, in the case of Bezos, it's particularly striking. There were revelations a few years ago by the US media ProPublica on the taxes paid by US billionaires, including Bezos. And you saw in some years some of these billionaires reporting very little income and paying very little income tax as a result. There's even one year when Bezos himself says, look, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits. And he receives family benefits. He receives a tax credit for his children, pays no income tax, but he receives a check from the government. And so it's all in the public domain. And there's nothing illegal in that. It's the way the system works. If you have found ways to have no taxable income, to have no income from the perspective of the tax system, then you don't have income tax to pay. So how did he do this? As CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay himself a wage. As the controlling shareholder of Amazon, he instructed the company not to pay out dividends. He didn't sell shares in the company, so he didn't realize any capital gains. And so his taxable income was really very low, even though his true economic income, which is his share of Amazon's profit or his wealth, are really high. And so his ability to pay taxes is really high. And basically what the studies have shown is that this problem is not just a few isolated cases like Bezos or the Google founders. It's just like Sergey Brin, Larry Page. They're in the same situation, and you can see that just from public data. They own shares in Alphabet, but the company until recently didn't pay out any dividend. They didn't sell any shares. They didn't pay themselves a wage, and so just no taxable income, and so no income tax paid. So you have these cases, but what the studies show is that it's a systematic problem. It's a systematic phenomenon that for the truly very wealthy, they very largely avoid the income tax. So that was the first problem in the argument made by Bezos, which is that, in fact, no, the billionaires, the upper middle class might pay a lot of income tax, sure, but the billionaires, no, they are outside of the system. They've not yet opted in. That's really what we've discovered collectively as a research community, which is that the income tax, which is a big democratic achievement of the beginning of the 20th century in many countries. The progressive income tax was created in the UK in 1909, in the US in 1913, in France in 1914. It is still an incomplete revolution. By and large, it works quite well for the middle class, for the upper middle class. There is some progressivity, but for the super rich, no, they're still not yet into the system. And so now the challenge and the reason why I wrote the book is to kind of complete this revolution, to bring the super rich into the system. So that was the first problem with Bezos, with the argument made by Bezos. And of course, the second problem is that he was looking just at one tax, the income tax. And when you look at all taxes paid, then the working class, the middle class pays a lot of tax. That's really important to remind people that, there's not just the income tax, there's consumption taxes, there's VAT here in the UK, and so on and so on. And that's a heavy burden for most of the population. And so, everybody contributes to funding our society. Everybody contributes to funding education, healthcare, and what makes us prosperous collectively, except the billionaires. Basically, who contribute, not exactly zero, they contribute. They like to remind us, and they're correct about that even though they might not pay a lot of tax personally, they pay some taxes indirectly through the businesses that they own, like the company pays some corporate tax. Okay, now if you take that into account, their total tax rate is 25%. When you look at the total tax rate of the average person, it's 50% in France. It's going to be a bit less in the UK, but in that, there's going to be a gap of that order of magnitude by a factor of 2.
So somebody, again, who's a skeptic of a wealth tax, let's say they're on the right, let's say they're doing quite well, are they actually sort of misunderstanding your argument? Because you're saying that actually the upper middle, let's say people earning around 100 grand a year in this country as well, there's an argument that we do tax them too much. Or if you think you're being overtaxed, there's possibly, there's a reason to feel that way. Like in the UK, for instance, there is a series of benefits you lose once you start earning more than £100,000. You don't get free childcare, you lose child benefit, you obviously, if you have a student loan, et cetera, so actually your effective rate is, your social wage goes down and your effective rate is quite high. And it feels like often those are the people batting for billionaires saying, no, we shouldn't do this. But those are the people who stand maybe the most to gain from recalibrating the tax system in the way that you're talking.
Well, certainly, I think it's true that in most countries, it's that group of the population that has the highest effective tax rate and much higher rate than billionaires.
Yeah,
which doesn't mean that they're paying too much tax. That's not the argument that I would be making. I think my argument is that the billionaires are paying way too little and that they should pay at least as much, and in fact, in reality, much more than the upper middle class, the rich but not super rich. So I don't. I would not argue, if you want, for saying, okay, let's tax billionaires in order to cut taxes for people who make £100,000. I don't think that's the most productive and useful use of that money. I think.
But you might say they should get free childcare, for instance, which they lose out on in this country at the moment.
I think we are going to have to continue the trend that started in the 20th century of mass public investment in education, in healthcare, in public infrastructure, which during the 20th century was really the key engine of economic growth and the rise in productivity. It was the fact that we transitioned from economies where the government, the tax to GDP ratio was 5-10% at the beginning of the 20th century. And so the government was really small, to a much bigger government with a tax to GDP ratio of around 40-50% of GDP in Western European countries, in Nordic countries, and massive public investment in the social state, in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure. And this is what has made, what has been central in the multiplication by a factor of 10 of productivity during the 20th century. And some people think that this happened once and we should stop there, and that's the end of history, and the government either can only stabilize or should shrink. And I think there's a good case to be made that probably this trend ought to continue at least a little bit, because when you think about it, what are going to be the main needs in the 21st century? We have population aging, which means we'll need more healthcare. We are going to need to invest massively in the energy transition. We need to invest more in higher education and in research. And so these are all areas of production where the private sector might have some role to play, but also where the public sector often is much more efficient than the private sector. Think about healthcare in the US, terribly inefficient, in addition to being very unfair, with very unequal access to care and very unequal health outcomes, but they're also very inefficient as opposed to healthcare in Europe, much more equal, but also more efficient. And so given that we are going to need more of those services, given that these immaterial sectors are going to grow in the 21st century, there's a good case to be made that we'll need more government revenue. Okay, and so what we need to think about is, how are we going to get there? And we're not going to get there only by taxing the super rich. I want to be very clear about that. But it's also going to be impossible to get there if we don't start taxing the super rich seriously.
Yeah, I think this is really key. You're saying it's not a silver bullet. The reason why I talk about the sort of affluent upper middle class being a really important audience in all of this is because right now, the social contract isn't really benefiting them in some ways, in so much as they don't get much from the state, because social democrats and the centre right have means tested everything for 40 years. So they don't get much from the state, but they are paying quite a lot in. And what that means is it loses legitimacy amongst those people. And I think that's part of the foundation of the radical right. Somebody who's on £100,000 is saying, well, hold on, I'm means tested. I can't get any of these other benefits, yet I'm paying tons in. The poorer sort of part of the population is getting them. And for me, there's an argument that, we need to increase capital gains, you need a wealth tax. I would actually lower the tax threshold in this country. I think, lower income earners should pay more. They should also get more because, and you talk about this in the book, it is part of the social contract, equality under the law, trial by jury, ability to own property, but taxation, these are all part of the same system historically, right?
Right.
And if we're losing one, if you're saying actually these people don't need to pay tax, the ultra rich and the ultra or the poorer, then society collapses, it seems to me.
I don't disagree with that, and I think the trend towards, exactly as you said, means testing everything, it's not a great way to organize redistribution. I think public provision, universal public provision of of essential goods and services, combined with a highly progressive tax system, that makes much more sense, and that would definitely support that.
Let me ask you a question. So if you look at the Nordics, per capita, they have way more billionaires than Britain. All of them. Norway's understandable to some extent, fossil fuel superpower. But Denmark, Finland, Sweden, they all have more billionaires per capita than the UK. Really striking. And for many people, Britain is part of that sort of Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon economic system. And that can be quite surprising to people. They say, well, hold on, the Nordics, so equal, social democratic, they have all these public provisions, yet they have more billionaires per capita than Britain. Yet in our heads, we associate billionaires as shorthand for high inequality, low trust sort of societies. So what's happening in Britain to have fewer? Also, France has more billionaires, I think, than Britain, right?
I think so. So first of all, I think it's important to remember that there's been a real explosion of billionaire wealth in Britain. Again, moving from 5% of GDP to 25% of GDP for the wealth of the 200 wealthiest families. It's really a big increase. That said, you're not wrong that the trend has been even more spectacular in a number of Nordic countries, especially Sweden. Is the kind of poster child for the upsurge of billionaire wealth. It's a relatively recent thing, and you have to realize that Sweden took a very pro-capital turn around 2007 when they abolished their wealth tax. They abolished their inheritance tax. They already in the 1990s had lower tax rates for capital income than labor income. They were some of these Nordic countries, some of the first countries to move to what is known as a dual income tax system, where you tax labor income progressively, but for capital income, it's a flat tax rate. Whether you own 10 million pounds in dividends, or 1 million, or 1,000, or 10 pounds, you pay the same rate. The Nordic countries in Sweden in 1993 were the first to move to that system. And so you've had this kind of a pretty big social experiment in Norway. In Sweden had gone, through different pretty radical phases. Sweden used to be one of the most unequal country in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Then became one of the most equal country in the world with the rise of the welfare state. And then since the late 1990s, and especially since 2007, they're experimenting something else, which is, okay, let's try to have a very pro-capital, pro-wealth type of policy. Now, what are the consequences of this? So you've seen an upsurge of billionaire wealth, that's for sure. And I think people should be concerned about that. Maybe Sweden is not yet at a stage like the US in terms of oligarchic or plutocratic influence on government. But again, in the US, things have accelerated very fast in just a few years, and so I think that people should be more concerned about that. But we'll see what happens in the future.
I find it interesting because there's in my mind there's billionaires and then there are billionaires. So if you look at France and Italy, and this is the thing I think is really lost on Brits. Your rich are really rich, right? The Arnauds and whatnot. And I think they're like, in terms of a tiny fraction of families owning so much, it's much worse in France than the UK. And then you look at Italy. We don't think of Italy as a particularly innovative economy, but they've got loads of billionaires, from these families where the great-great-grandfather started making loafers or whatever, or sunglasses, and now, Ferrero Rocher and whatnot. There are billionaires and billionaires. And what I find interesting is that lots of the billionaires that you find in places like Italy and France, they have some attachment to real production, whereas in the US and the UK, it's more about finance, real estate, the new economy. I suppose, are there? This is a strange question, maybe, but are there ideological differences? So, for instance, if there's an Italian industrialist who's made a ton of money and, they're billionaires, in your experience, do they have sort of different political attitudes to what should happen with the economy more generally? Are they more pro-industrial policy, right?
No, my view is, what I find funny is that I've been involved in these debates in different countries, and what I experience regularly is like for instance in the US, when you talk about US billionaires in the US, for a long time they said, well, our billionaires are the good billionaires. They're
Right.
innovative. They create startups. They're self-made, as opposed to the Russian billionaires. They're really bad. But then when you talk about that in France they say, well, our billionaires, well, they're really good people. They're not like those US billionaires, those tech oligarchs. That's not like that in France. And then, when you talk about billionaires in Sweden, they say, well, our billionaires are the good ones. And no, the reality is that this is not about this has nothing to do about the individuals themselves. Some billionaires may be nice people, others less so, but just like in the population in general, this is just a question of money. This is deep down a question of how do we organize our society and our collective consumption and collective infrastructure and education and health. And are we sure that this class, this part of the population, which, by the way, benefits a lot from public spending, right? That the reason why their businesses have been able to thrive is because there's been so much investment in infrastructure, and sometimes they receive lots of subsidies for their companies and so on. Are we sure that that part of the population is contributing their fair share? No, this is what it is about. And I think the question of whether they're good or bad people, or whether they're innovative or not innovative, or whether they're self-made or inheritors, or whether they're in that sector or this sector, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that if you have a certain amount of wealth, you shouldn't be able to live outside of society. So you should pay, that's the proposal in the book, you should pay an unavoidable minimum amount of tax, no matter what your income is, no matter whether you're nice or beautiful, or we don't care. If you're very wealthy, you have to pay a minimum, period. And that's the principle, that I try to defend in the book. That we need to create this new principle that, and it's totally obvious. I think who can disagree with that? That there is no right, if you are an extremely wealthy person, to pay no tax. So there has to be a floor. There has to be a floor. I think everybody agrees with that. And by the way, it's shocking, and it will come to be seen as a kind of an anomaly that this is not yet explicitly written in our laws. If you're extremely wealthy, you have to pay a minimum. And then the question becomes, okay, but how do we compute the minimum? Now, if you compute the minimum as a fraction of income, it doesn't work. That's the whole problem. Bezos can report no income. So let's say the US was to create a minimum income tax of 25% on billionaires. 25% of zero is zero. Nothing has changed for them. By the way, France did that a couple of years ago. They passed a minimum tax on the very rich as a fraction of income. There was no complaint from the billionaires. Nobody heard about it. It generates no revenue. It's total failure. So you don't want to do that. The minimum, to be effective, it has to be expressed as a fraction of wealth, which is much harder to manipulate than income. And so that's just the basic idea. And of course, then you can consider different tax rates, but the tax rate that everybody, no matter their views about redistribution, about how progressive the tax system should be, but the tax rate that everybody should support, and that frankly almost everybody supports, is 2% of wealth. Why 2%? Because this is the tax rate that would ensure that the billionaires cannot pay less tax than the rest of the population. That's how it was computed.
That's the sweet spot.
That's a Swiss. I mean, in the sense that I'm not saying it's the optimal or even necessarily desirable tax rate. It's the tax rate you cannot want less than that.
Yeah.
Less than that would mean accepting that the billionaires have a right to pay less tax than ordinary people. Who can support that? Again, we all have different views about the proper degree of tax progressivity, but nobody should be able to support that the notion that the billionaires should be allowed to pay less. And so that's the proposal. It's really very consensual. It was designed like that. A proposal to be totally consensual. It was designed like that because it comes from some work that I did for the G20 when Brazil had the presidency of the G20 in 2024, and they wanted to put some new ideas for international cooperation on the agenda of the G20. And so they asked me, "What do you think? What should we do?" And in 2021, there had been an agreement among 130 countries to create a minimum tax, very basic, with lots of problems, of 15% on multinational companies. Despite its problems, a step in the right direction, because it was the first time that countries agreed on a common minimum tax rate. And the idea of a minimum tax is powerful because it's the idea that you're going to curb all possible forms of tax avoidance. You're not going after one loophole or another. You're saying whatever you're doing, you as a big multinational company, at the end of the day, your tax cannot fall below 15% of your profit. Okay, good. And so I told the Brazilian government, I think we should do the same for billionaires. It's the same problem. They've benefited a lot from globalization. They don't pay taxes. And so let's have a minimum tax. And so I wanted to put something on the map that would be viable in a forum like the G20, where you can't go and say, look, let's do the tax revolution. I'm all in favor of that. Let's have a ton of progressivity. But I wanted to start a conversation. And so I thought, okay, the proposal that everybody should be able to support is this, 2%. And so
on people who have more than 100 million euros.
So yeah, to be very clear, so it's the way it works is that if you have more than $100 million or pounds or euros, more than 100 million, and you pay less than 2% of your wealth in personal taxes, like income tax, then you would have to pay some extra tax to reach this floor of 2%. So it's the fairest and most targeted tax that you can imagine, because it's not only on those super rich people, but on those among the super rich who avoid taxation today. Someone who would pay a decent amount of tax, more than 2% of their wealth, would not be affected. You cannot imagine something that's more targeted and fair than that. But it turns out that because these billionaires, they pay very little in tax, it would make a difference for them. And so it would bring quite a lot of tax revenue. For the world as a whole, we are talking about $450 billion in tax revenue globally. So that's 0.4% of world GDP, which is more than all the money that we spend globally on development aid and all international agencies combined. And for a country like the UK, as I said, it's about 15 billion pounds. So it's a lot of money. It's not. I want to be very clear about one thing. It's not with 2% that you're going to fix wealth inequality. It's not enough because the wealth of billionaires is growing so fast. It's growing 10% per year, when the wealth of the average person has been growing like 4% a year. So if you wanted to just stabilize wealth concentration, you would need a rate of 10 minus 4 of about 6% on wealth for the super rich. If you wanted to reduce wealth concentration, you would need tax rates for the super rich of more than 6% of wealth. For instance, Bernie Sanders in 2019, when he ran for president, he had a proposal for a progressive wealth tax with rates of up to 8% for people who own more than $10 billion in wealth. And that makes a lot of sense if your objective is to curb wealth concentration, which is extremely important and which I fully support. What the minimum tax, the 2% minimum tax does is that it addresses another issue. It addresses this issue that came to light recently of tax regressivity, of the super rich paying less than the rest of the population, which, is I think a genuine problem and something that no one should accept and that we need to fix. But once we've fixed it, it doesn't mean that we've solved the problem of wealth concentration. So we will have to do more. But I think a good starting point is this 2% minimum tax on wealth for the super rich.
That's really interesting, because when I've heard that 2% in circulation, it's been presented as this is how we can rebuild, a solidaristic, fair, egalitarian state. But what you're saying is it would need to be much higher, 6-8%. We won't say that for now, because like I said, don't scare the horses. As
No,
they
but
say.
I mean, I want to be perfectly transparent and honest about that. That this proposal is more like a bit like a center-right proposal.
That's kind of what it feels like.
But it is, generally in the same way as, for instance, in the famous People's Budget of 1909, Lloyd George, it was the creation of the progressive income tax at the time. The UK used to have a flat income tax of 2% on all incomes since 1843, and in 1909. There's a People's Budget. Lloyd George says, okay, we need to fund pensions for workers. Let's introduce a very modest super tax of 2.5% on the very highest incomes, on top of the regular 2%, for the 10,000 wealthiest people in the UK. That's the proposal. Extremely modest. But the conservatives, the aristocrats, they hate it. They fight like crazy. The House of Lords vetoes the People's Budget, right? And even though it was, very moderate, very modest, and that led to essentially the demise of the House of Lords. Then you have the Parliament Act of 1911. That's the end of the veto power of the House of Lords, and then. Of course, 2.5% was really modest, but it also kind of started a whole process, first of, step towards more democracy, but also the beginning of the income tax, which then became very progressive over the course of the 20th century, because at some point then the UK had nearly 100% top marginal income tax rate, more than 90% after World War II. And so, to some extent, the 2% minimum tax is a bit like the Lloyd George 2.5% super tax. I think it could really be, if it's implemented, like an important step forward. But also, clearly, it's not going to be the end of history. And in the 21st century, we'll experiment with, I think, much more than that.
A pragmatic, moderate, centre-right wealth tax. That period of British history, you said the People's Budget 1909, is so fascinating for me. It has so many lessons, because what you always hear from political commentators is we live in this crazy time, unprecedented crises. But when you look at Britain, there's a great book, Strange Death of Liberal Britain, Liberal England, by George Dangerfield. And he talks about the collapse of the Liberals, the rise of the trade union movement, feminists blowing up Lloyd George's house, Home Rule for Ireland. And it's crazy to think that more than 100 years ago, more than 110 years ago, there's a guy talking about a wealth tax, and yet today you're going to go into TV studios and talk to newspaper editors and they'll say, this is ridiculous. Yeah. What have we come to, a wealth tax? And yet it could have happened, before our great-grandparents were born.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, and the wealth tax, the 2% minimum tax, I think it, on the super rich, I think it will end up happening. I don't see how it doesn't happen, to be honest. In France, it came very close to passing just a few months ago in October, during the budget discussion, and it passed first. It was voted by the National Assembly in France in February of 2025. First time ever you had a House of Parliament anywhere in the world that created a tax like that. And then it was blocked by the Senate, and then it came back in the National Assembly, and, after a huge campaign by the billionaires, against it, and then it didn't pass. But frankly, it's going to come back very soon, perhaps as soon as the next budget, in a few months. And if it doesn't pass in 2026 in France, it will be a central issue of the presidential election of 2027. And then after what started in France, you've had a number of countries in the European Union who have started to introduce bills in parliament that are mimicked on the French bill, which itself is just the G20 proposal of 2024. So that includes Belgium, that includes the Netherlands, that perhaps soon includes Spain. So there is the beginning of an international movement. And that's also why I like the analogy with, early 20th century, because it's also exactly what happened with the progressive income tax, where at the same time, around 1909, you had different countries moving in that direction. A big revolution, because for centuries taxation had been only about taxing consumption, so very unfair, or just flat, low income taxes, where the rich paid as much as the poor. And it all starts to change in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it took, some time. These are always fierce battles, hard fought. In the UK, it involved kind of constitutional crisis. In the US, they had to change the constitution because the Supreme Court in the late 19th century had ruled the federal income tax unconstitutional, so they had to pass the 16th Amendment in 1913 to create a federal income tax. In France, the National Assembly passed the progressive income tax in 1909. It was blocked during 5 years by the Senate, which only ended up voting it on the eve of World War I. And so these are always complicated, even though the rates are very low, but broadening the scope of democracy, bringing the rich into the system is always difficult. It takes time. And so even though I'm very confident that this will happen, it's very hard to know whether it's going to happen in a matter of months or a matter of years. Who knows?
So you make this all sound like very sensible, pragmatic, maybe even inevitable, right? I believe you. I personally think it's necessary, and I can see why somebody on the centre-right would adopt it. Why aren't more economists saying it? Because you're a rare voice. You're not the only voice, but you're a rare voice. So why, if it's so common sense and necessary and probably is inevitable, why isn't it not a mainstream economic view?
So two answers. So number one is that you do have a lot of support, in fact, among economists. First of all, you have a lot of support in the population as a whole. Like everywhere, it's like 80%, 90% of the population that supports this. You don't see such numbers, similar numbers for any other type of economic or social policy reform. So extraordinarily popular. I think among economists, it's perhaps also 70, 80% of economists who support this. So for instance, you had last year in July, an op-ed in Le Monde that was signed by 7 Nobel Prize winners in support of that. And in the French context, where they said, well, it's a great idea. And not only it's a great idea, but France can and should do it on its own. Don't wait for an international agreement. Do it and lead by example. 7 Nobel Prize winners. Of course, you're going to always to find some economists who don't like it. And what's the reason why there is some resistance? I think the main reason is because there's a long experience with wealth taxation in European countries in particular over the course of the 20th century. And those wealth taxes, they didn't work well. And for reasons that I'm going to explain, but they didn't work well. And so many economists, they have kind of a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and they think, oh, it's about reintroducing those wealth taxes, which didn't work very well, so that's not a good idea. But when they do that, they don't understand that this proposal is not at all about reintroducing the wealth tax that used to exist in France or in Germany or in Sweden. It's kind of the opposite in many ways. So first of all, why do I say that those wealth taxes didn't work very well? So I spent a lot of time with my colleagues study the international experience with wealth taxation. And the conclusion was, and I agree with the economists who say that, the conclusion was that these wealth taxes, they were failures. And there are two ways to look at that failure. There's one way, which is, okay, we've tried wealth taxes in the past, they didn't work, hence they will never work, forget about it. And there's another way, which is, and this is what we've tried to do in our work, which is, okay, let's try to understand what failed, what were the problems, let's try to draw lessons, and let's try to think about whether those problems have solutions. And the answer is that they do have solutions. And we can do much better than what was done in the past. So what were the two problems? There were two problems with past wealth taxes. Number one is that the super rich were essentially legally exempted from those wealth taxes. The law was written such that for the super rich, they didn't have to pay the tax. How was it done? So in the book, I tell the story of France, which is perhaps one of the most extreme case. In 1981, there's a socialist president who's elected, and the Socialist Party has an absolute majority in parliament. They create a wealth tax. But very quickly, so the billionaires complain and, we don't like it. And very quickly, they introduce an exemption and they say, okay, if someone owns more than 25% of the shares of a company, so if you're a big shareholder, we are going to exempt that wealth from the wealth tax. So if you're really big enough, you don't have to pay the tax. But that's exactly, what it means to be a billionaire. The billionaires, their wealth is exactly that. It's big stakes, big shareholdings in big corporations. And so the consequence of that is that the effective wealth tax rate for the French billionaires was 0.005%. They just didn't pay it, and it's crazy. It's like if the US tomorrow created a wealth tax and said, well, but we're going to exempt Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And why? So first lesson is don't do that. Just don't exempt the super rich. It doesn't make any sense. So that's number one. Why did they, well, number one, let me talk about number two first. The second problem with the past wealth taxes is that they never tried to tackle the issue of migration, tax exile, the risk, the threat that they always agitate of moving to other countries, to tax havens. And many countries, and it's been really a blind spot of the social democratic experiment in Western Europe, perhaps the most important blind spot, which is that it has always taken as a given that there is international competition, and tax competition in particular, and that it's a kind of law of nature, like gravity. And we are just powerless to address that. The only way we can adapt is by slashing taxes on the super rich, on those mobile taxpayers, and including multinational companies. But this view is profoundly wrong. It's profoundly wrong because, first, of course, you can try to forge international agreements, you can try to create coordination, cooperation, and we've been able to do that for multinational firms in some sense in 2021. But more fundamentally, because there's a lot of things that one country alone can do to prevent capital flight, to prevent tax-driven migration. So very concretely, for instance, any country on its own, the UK, let's say tomorrow the UK introduces its 2% minimum tax on the super rich. What the UK could do and what the UK should absolutely do exactly at the same time as it introduces this tax is to say, okay, if you've lived for a long time in the UK and became really rich there, and now you move to another country, that's your right, but we will keep taxing you after you've left for a number of years, as if you were still a resident, a tax resident of the UK, for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. We can discuss. The UK can do that. There's no need for an international agreement. This is already, in some sense, what the US does. The US has taxation that's based upon citizenship, meaning if you have US citizenship and you move abroad, you have to keep paying taxes in the US, no matter where you live, until you die.
It's only one of two countries that has that.
It's only
right?
one of two. And you can say, perhaps the system is not ideal, because you can imagine someone who was born in the US, so has US citizenship, and then their parents moved when they were 2 months old. And yet imagine that person never sets foot again in the US, and still he or she has to pay taxes until the rest of her life. That's a bit extreme. But what the UK and almost all other countries do is exactly the opposite extreme, and is much less defensible. You've spent all your life in the UK, you became a billionaire, now you move, and immediately the UK says, well, that's it. That's good. We'll stop taxing you. So you can, in effect, you can secede from society. You can move to Dubai or to Monaco and pay zero tax in those countries, even though your wealth Of course, was a social creation, a collective success, like all wealth creation. You benefited from infrastructure, from education, from healthcare, from the law courts that protected your property, and so on and so on. But you also benefited from all the knowledge that's been accumulated over centuries by all of humanity. So there is just, you have duties towards society, towards humanity. So you cannot just say, that's it, I'm done, I became rich, thanks to all the hard work of everybody, and now I move to another planet. That's just impossible to defend. And so what's more important is, how do we make sure that it's not possible? Well, any country could say, we are going to collect the taxes that your new country, Dubai or Monaco, chooses not to collect. So you're free to move. If you move to a country that taxes you as much as the UK, so if you move to another country that also has this 2% tax, then you have nothing extra to pay to the UK. You're good. But if you move to a country that taxes you less than the UK, then the UK would collect the difference so that it would be neutral for you to, from a tax perspective, to be in London or in Dubai or in Monaco. No difference. So that's really the most important idea in all of that. It's both that it's feasible. It has never been done except in the US in some sense, not exactly the same system. It has never been done because I think for a long time there was this fear that once people have left, it's just too hard to keep tracking their income and their wealth. Like if they move to Switzerland, there used to be a very strict bank secrecy. So there was this view that, it was just impossible to enforce such a system, I think. But since 2018, there's an automatic exchange of bank information. So HMRC receives data automatically from all banks in tax havens all over the world. So now it can use that information to keep tracking the wealth and the income of ex-UK billionaires who would move to those tax havens and keep taxing them. And so we can do it, we should do it, and tax competition is not this law of nature. It's not gravity. It's man-made. We choose to accept it. We choose to tolerate it. We choose to encourage it. Frankly, the current system encourages international competition, but we can choose the opposite. We can choose to fight it. And so if you want the billionaire tax to work, in contrast to all past wealth taxes, you need two crucial ingredients. Number one, no exemption whatsoever. No exemption whatsoever. So the first paragraph of the law should be, if you have more than whatever, let's say 100 million pounds, you have to pay at least 2% of your wealth, period. Everybody understands that if you're so wealthy, you don't need any kind of relief. Paragraph 2, if you move abroad, it keeps applying for 10 years, let's say. If the law is written like that, it will be completely different from past wealth taxes. They can almost the opposite. It would bring a lot of revenue. There would not be any kind of tax avoidance possible. It would be fair in the sense that the wealthiest people will be made to contribute. And so that's what some economists have not yet kind of understood. They've not made yet sometimes the effort of understanding that this is a new proposal. This is not recreating what existed in the past. It is learning the lessons from past mistakes and proposing something new and effective.
I mean, that sounds very sensible to me. Again, the enforcement of it, 5 or 10 years. I mean, the person that comes to mind for me is Jim Ratcliffe, who's Britain's wealthiest person. He moved to Monaco. And what's extraordinary is he buys Manchester United Football Club, or I think 25% equity in the company. And, they're building a new stadium. And the first thing he does when they're building the new stadium is he says, I want subsidies from Westminster because we want to turn it into the Wembley of the North. Can we have, taxpayer money, but you don't want to be a taxpayer? You want us, therefore, to have a system that more closely resembles the US. How would enforcement work? So how does the IRS, let's say I'm an American national, I moved to Dubai, I stopped paying my taxes, and it's lower marginal rate of tax in Dubai. They want to collect the difference. How do they do that? Am I going to see Gabriel Zucman is chief advisor to the chancellor in this country. We implement this policy. Do we start having the Royal Marines going into jumping on people's boats in Dubai and Monaco? Because the US already does it, right?
The US does it, yeah.
So how does it work? How do they enforce it?
The way it works is that if, first of all, there's an automatic exchange of bank information. So the banks in Dubai they send information to the IRS, just like they send information to HMRC. So, the IRS uses that. HMRC could use that and say, look, you've earned X, so you have to pay income tax. If you don't, you're breaking the law. Okay? And so, you always have some people who break the law. Not only people who might be in Dubai, but they might be in the US and fail to file their tax return. And so then, it's just the way it works in those cases, right? So there can be asset seizures, there's going to be some prosecution. And in the case of billionaires, I think enforcement would be easier because the billionaires, even if they move to Dubai, they still have ties to the UK. And they're always going to have ties to the UK. They want to be there, they have families, they have friends, they have social networks, but also more fundamentally, their wealth derives from owning multinational companies that have access and want to have access to the UK market. And sometimes they have factories, they have capital in the UK. And so if they break the law, then the UK government, the HMRC, has leverage to make them pay. If you don't pay, we're going to seize some of your real estate in the UK. We're going to seize some of the assets of the companies that you own, like other criminals. So that's how enforcement will work. I don't think we'll get to that because I think they will pay, right? We're talking about 2%. If it was a tax rate of 100%, we could perhaps have that discussion. But when it's 2% in a context where their wealth is growing 10% per year, the truth is that it's not going to make a material difference to them. It's going to make a big difference for the UK budget, £15 billion. But for them, okay, they don't like to pay taxes, but they will keep doing whatever they're doing if their wealth grows 8% as opposed to 10% a year.
You make it sound so easy. In my mind, I'm thinking Royal Marines and Special Forces, people saying they're breaking the law. And it's true, most people don't want to break the law. My final question, what does society, and let's stick with Europe really, and the US, what does the West, Europe, Western Europe and America look like if we don't start taxing wealth, if we just let the next 15 years look like the last 15 with regards to these accelerating returns to the ultra-rich?
Well, the main risk clearly is the acceleration of the oligarchic tendencies that we are witnessing today. Okay, so the main problem is that our tax systems structurally fail to tax the super rich. And so it has this failure has a snowballing effect on wealth concentration. Because what it means is that for regular people, they earn income, they first have to pay income tax, and then with whatever remains after they've consumed, they can save, they can add to their wealth. But the way it works for the billionaires is not that. They earn income, they don't have to pay tax, their consumption is really very small relative to their income, and so they can save almost 100% of their income. So structurally, their wealth grows faster than the wealth of everybody else. And so if we don't break that spiral, we're going to see more wealth at the top, extreme wealth, more concentration of power, leading to more wealth at the top, more concentration of power. So this is the cycle. This is the battle, frankly, of the 21st century, the battle between oligarchic forces and democratic forces on the other hand. And, winning that battle for democracy is going to involve a number of policy changes. And we're not going to be able to fix all the problems with taxation, but taxation, and for the very wealthy, it has to be based on wealth, is going to be a crucial part of the solution. So, if we want to win that, if we want democracy to win that battle, we need to make that transition. Like we made the transition a century ago to progressive income taxation. Now we need to make that transition towards progressive wealth taxation for the super rich.
So if we don't do it, democracy is at stake.
It is. It is really at stake. Look at what's happening in the US and look at the pace at which extreme wealth is growing and the influence of the super rich is growing globally. And I think, we can make the case, certainly in a country like the US, but not only that a lot of what's happening to policymaking in particular is downstream of the upsurge of billionaire wealth and influence. I think this is the battle of the 21st century.
Gabriel Zucman, fabulous to talk to you.
Thank you.
Your book, We Need to Tax Billionaires, is out now. Very short, very useful, very timely. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much.